Hello, I'm Barbara Bogue, and as chair of the Friends of Holland Hills, I'm delighted to welcome you to our first conversation of 2022 with bee specialist Sam Droege. A little bit about our speaker today. Sam is a native bee specialist with the United States Geological Survey, Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. Today, Sam will explain what YARD is doing to save bees. Sam's professional contributions are broad, varied, and frankly, really amazing. Sam's current focus is developing an inventory and monitoring program for native bees, which includes an online identification guides for North American bees. Also with Jessica Zelt, he's reviving the North American bird phrenology program. Finally, to give you an inkling of how engaging this conversation is bound to be, I want to share a auto reply message that we got from Sam. It's the best auto reply ever. It says in full, Mondays are Sacred Bee Identification Day. I will not be answering email. Thanks, Sam. So on to Sam. Thank you very much for being with us, Sam.
All right. Well, I'm going to have to work hard to get up to speed on that introduction. Thank you very much. So I'm going to get right into my slides. We are going to cover those things and look specifically at what can be done in relatively small suburban yards and how that's significant for bees and actually other things. Let me see, try to click on that. And look, there's talk is still there. And get into there. So this will show at the end too. I have contact information. We also write little chatty blog posts about the bees that we take photographs of. And so you can follow us if you're a follower of Instagram at USGS BIML. Again, that's going to show up later. And we have quite a long set of files and links. If you email me, I can send those to you if you really want to get into bees. But here is the bee lab, which is really an old garage and was surrounded, is industrial. It was used to store grain and other non-living person kinds of things. But we like it because we can do whatever we want, including flipping the surrounds to a native bee study area. And, you know, this was basically just overturned subsoil, maybe not far from perhaps some of your houses, depending on how they treated you. So if we can do it there, you'll be successful too, just to show you how relatively easy it is in some ways. And we'll show you our technique for flipping areas. This is a gravel parking lot. We did not do anything other than bury it in chips and then plant directly into it. And this is the year after that. So we'll show you some of those techniques, and I'm going to spend the first part of it telling you why bringing in more native plants and therefore more native bees is a useful thing. So we have to go back a ways, 4.5 billion years ago, and the evolution of the continents and plants and bees. About 150 million years ago, plants started handshaking with bees. And all that is to say that this area is equally as biodiverse and interesting and important as tropical rainforest, the Arctic, any wilderness area that you might think of. We have our own sets of plants and our own sets of bees that are restricted largely to the eastern United States and some of these areas from the mountains all the way to the coastal plains. So, and I'll show you some examples right from Dyke Marsh, where we have globally rare bees in this case, but all my talks will be about bees and focused on bees. But the reality is that these plants are in relationship to many different types of insects. They're supporting them. They're often incredibly restricted. Only a few plants are supporting only a few insects. And we'll see examples from the bee world and how that fits in with backyards too. But it goes for many things, including even the soil fungi and the bacteria and the ungulates, and it goes on and on. It's a complete system. We've broken it up. A place like Alexandria or any other suburban area is not necessarily let's give it up and let's give some money to the local refuge type of thing, you can bring back a lot of this biodiversity right into your neighborhoods, because in particular, plants and insects work at that scale. No, you're not probably going to have bison and wolves like in the old days, 1600s, but yes, you can have almost any of these different species. And we'll show plenty of examples of that. Okay, so just to give you an idea about how long all of this has been going on, 150 million years ago, this is what the Earth looked like. Okay, so nature has been at this a really long time. And so these relationships and what we've been gifted with here in the Mid-Atlantic is something that has been crafted over millennia. So it's very complex. We shouldn't expect that, we can just simply come in and plant a few plants, or that, we have, we can control everything and there's not a lot of unknowns. It's really complicated, but I'm going to repeat over and over that by planting back some of these native plants, which are in sync with the area that we live in, you automatically are beginning to recreate some of the things that were lost. I don't know if I even need to say anything about this. So all that complexity, has been erased with what's the de facto socially acceptable landscape, which is not native, requires tons of fertilization. The soils are compacted, sheets off water, and creates the dead zone in the Chesapeake, amidst a million other kinds of things that as a biologist I could harp and whine about. But I think, you kind of get my point just by looking at that. So I also need to point out another essentially invasive species and put that in a context. This is our, I guess this is our touchstone. This is the species, when we talk about bees, most people just stop at honeybees. So I think most of you know they're not native, they're culturally important. They're really one of the few insects that create a commodity, honey, for us. They're actually controlled and regulated by the USDA. And they're very, very, very different from our native species. So this species doesn't occur even in the hemisphere. And the lifestyle of the honeybee is so different that really I tell people you need to now forget everything you know about honeybees, because none of that applies to the native species. In terms of ecology, the wild bees do all the pollination we need. And if you want honey, you have to have a honeybee, because as I mentioned, wild bees do not do anything that honeybees do, including give us honey, but everything else is in the bag when we just work with the natives that we have in the area. I'll also point out that if you like honeybees, you should have them, but you're not doing the world a favor by having them, because they're competitors with the wild bees. And even in the sense of saving honeybees, they have basically problems with introduced pests, and having more of them doesn't really solve that issue. But they're cool, so I'm not putting the finger down, but I'm just saying that if you think that you want to have honeybees simply because it's a good thing, it's not a good thing for the area. So when we talk about bees, it's a pretty simple equation. So saving bees is all about saving pollen, because all bees, no matter what their lifestyle, are using pollen to feed their young. It's the pinch point in all of this. They have to have pollen, and it turns out they're very picky about what kinds of pollen. A lot of time. We will have no time for very many stories about all this cool pickiness, but to come back around to what do you do, it's a diversity of native plants. So it's not the 5 native plants that you may find at Lowe's hardware store, nursery department. It's the region's native plants. Each of those has a set of bees that it favors, and each bee has a set of plants that it favors. And so you don't have to know all the details. I love the details. You don't need to know all the details. Planting native plants that bloom throughout the year, and you're 80% of a good job. Think of a city like your neighborhood as basically an ecosystem. If you have a large number of people planting a series of native plants, even if it's not necessarily coordinated, bees can fly. They're good at dispersers if they come out of their nest and they don't see immediately in your yard the things that they're looking for in terms of the particular kind of plant. They're going to fly until they find that, which could very well be your neighbor. So in thinking about these kinds of things, you'll realize that you can make this difference, and the more people that are working on planting back their yards, the better. And a lot of times, because we subsidize yards with water and tender care and things like that, these can become quite high populations of our native species in our bees. I'm not going to go into any detail, but the antithesis to that are the mosquito people, Mosquito Joe, Mosquito Patrol, those kinds of things, which, well, I'm not going to go into it because I just go down a rabbit hole on that one. It's not a good thing because they kill everything. So, but I want to point out plants spend a lot of plant money. All this photosynthesis comes in, some of it they push into the soil to get their nutrients back out, working with the bacteria and fungi down there. But a lot of that money goes into creating pollen and nectar, and they create sometimes a lot. So here, for example, if you plant one sunflower, there's enough pollen, may not all be used, but there's enough pollen in there for literally hundreds of bees. So by bee, I mean the pollen that would go into a baby bee nest. So it turns out, like, if you start thinking about that, you start thinking about flowers and the number of flowers, there are a lot of bees that could be supported out there, and our back of the envelope calculations are that in the region, the average area has about 26,000 bees being supported in an acre per year. So it's a lot. There's a lot of bees out there. There can be more and more diversity and more concern about some of these conservation issues, the more diverse plantings there are. And a lot of times we find, and I'll show you some examples of how seemingly middle of the city kinds of environments, which are surrounded by high quality plantings, can have quite a few different bee species in there. So just want to say that, again, not a honeybee thing is that about a quarter of the native bees can't even sting, like the species is incapable of pushing their stinger into your hand. No one's allergic to it. There's no barbed stings. And in general, most of them nest in the ground, and they don't defend their nest because they're not colonial. We don't have that system at all. The big, probably closest thing we get are bumblebees, which, again, most people, there's actually plenty of bumblebees. Small side story, Reston, a couple of years ago, someone applied poison to a linden tree by doing a soil drench. They essentially made the whole tree poisonous, killed all the bees that went to it. Someone spent a couple hours, well, they made one trip and they picked up all the bumblebees that were dead simply right around the trees that they could find. 2,000 bumblebees in that one tree. Bad, and who knew that there were that many bumblebees in the area? So again, just another notion, there are a lot of bees around. What you do can matter, and you can increase that by switching and swapping out some of these environments to higher dollar kinds of things. But you're not bringing in a allergic reaction problem to the neighbor's little darlings. So I just want to show here architecture of flowers. So you have to ask, why isn't there one kind of flower that the bee, say the honeybee, goes to? And the answer is that the architecture of bees has evolved over that 150 million years to fit certain types and kinds of plants, and the deal works out well for both groups. So the plant gets high efficiency pollination by having a select number of pollinators that are its friends, and the bees get the yummy protein and other fats and lipids that the plants produce. So you know flowers because you go to a florist shop. Florist shop is really designed by bees with some variation by plant breeders. And just realize that diversity, although at a very small scale that we're not paying attention to, and beauty is there for our bee populations too. So I'm giving you little vignettes because it's complicated. It's like someone coming in and say, in an hour, I'm gonna tell you everything you need to know about birds. So, and birds, they have hardly been here evolutionarily compared to bees. So one thing to think about is our trees. So some trees do not produce pollen because they're wind pollinated. These are the trees we're allergic to, by the way. But some do have that agreement with bees and other insects too. And here's a listing of a variety of them. The thing I want to point out about trees is that in addition to their other merits, they also produce tons of pollen per unit of land. You know, just compare your little daisy bed to a gigantic red maple, and you could see that the volume, or even an apple tree or a crab, that volume is quite large. And so when these trees bloom, it's pulling in tons of bees from everywhere to capitalize on this mega load of pollen, if those bees, you know, are looking for that kind of pollen. So like I mentioned, some of them are not. Trees tend to be basically party plants, which is like, okay, we're not going to be picky because we're only going to bloom for about a week and a half. And so we're, you know, letting everyone come and, you know, have some pollen and nectar, and we'll get pollinated because of that. I have to stop digressing here so much. There, each of these has its own very interesting story in that list, and we can go through every species of flowering plant, and they have a different story about how they're working the environment. I also point out that within a lot of what amounts to city or suburban areas, a lot of these areas are essentially partial forests, right? We have a lot of shade trees planted, but yet there are also quite a number of plants, again, plants equals bees, that are in those environments. On the acid end of the scale, like on the coastal plain, you're getting a lot of ericaceous shrubs. So those would be the blueberries, huckleberries, lyonias, rhododendrons, azaleas. And on the sweet side, you're right in between, actually. On the sweet side, like you can see this, go up to George Washington Parkway and take a walk in the woods in the spring. On the sweet side of the scale, you're getting all kinds of things like spring beauties, trilliums, and, you know, things that you would recognize. Each of those has a separate set of bees that come to them, and they are worthy things to plant in your probably fairly shady lawn. So think about that. Think about forest systems as a model. One place that does this extremely well, worth a special trip in the spring, is Mount Cuba, Northern Delaware. Arboretum was a wooded environment, not a great wooded environment, but it was wooded. And then they made it into a native plant arboretum. Unbelievable grounds, and not that big, really. And I had a colleague who went out and did surveys, and they found on these grounds, which were rich in plants, all sorts of new records for bees in Delaware. Sort of a you build it, they will come kind of thing. That one, Andrena pulmonii, which is Jacob's ladder, not Greek valerian, as I put there, but the nearest record for that bee species was the border of West Virginia and Ohio. So this is the kind of thing that can happen anywhere. That particular spot is nothing special. You guys are surrounded by high dollar bee environments, and you could equally have these populations there too, if you plant them. So if those plants on that list are not there, those bees not there either. So again, we point back to biodiversity and planting and choices. I should also mention that if you have plants that are not native to the area, the diversity of bees that goes to those goes way down. And essentially, those plants may have bees. So you may say, well, I've seen bees on my, you know, honeysuckle. Well, that's true. But it's like also, if you put out a bird feeder, there are birds there. But are those high dollar birds? Probably not. Those are the crows and sparrows of the world. And so a lot of the plants that are not native do have bees, and they're supportive of a, you know, the common don't need your help really humans sets of bees. So not bad, but you could do a whole lot better by inviting in a lot of these native species. And additionally, as I mentioned, there's many other kinds of creatures that also need these individual kinds of native plants and turn their noses up on the, you know, non-native introductions. So these are just examples. Each of those has a story, different architecture, different kinds of things. These are just one tiny example of good bee plants in the spring. The spring is when the highest number of bees per acre are active. Many of those bees are only out in that spring period. Some only go to one or two different kinds of plants. Others will go to a variety, but only in the spring. And then what happens is there's a smaller set, but more abundant set of tiny little bees. Most of these bees are the size of a grain of rice that cover the entire gamut of the year. And they use many different kinds of plants. So their MO is, I can tolerate all the different kinds of chemical makeups in the pollens of many different plants by mixing them together. I should point out that a lot of plants, frankly, are trying to poison their non-special friend bees by putting in straight out toxins or at least repellents. And the bees that are their specialists, let's call it, they are tolerant of those, and other species are not. So again, gets into some really interesting, complicated systems. We can look also at the end of summer, August, September, October. There's an entirely different set of bees that come out during that time. They're using a lot of these yellow composites, and you can see again some examples here. I'll show some more. Here's an example of where someone, Wendy Brister, who lives in York, Pennsylvania, I visited her house. It's, I don't want to knock Wendy or anything, but it's not like it's not like Mount Cuba. There's not millions of plants. It's just nice. And that she had some plantings, and she had planted, because she works at a nursery, she had planted some American alum roots, so Heuchera americana. And it's the native Heuchera. If you are a plant person, you know that Heucheras are planted willy-nilly everywhere. They're pretty tolerant, but those are inevitably some hybrid swarm with the European Asian species, and they frankly don't attract much in the way of bee traffic. But our native species has a bee, so there's it in its native habitat, has a bee, and you wouldn't not know it from looking at it from all the other Heucheras. It's just the native one, of which there's more than one actually. So here's a bee, Cleides estivalis, that everyone kind of thought had disappeared from the planet because it hadn't been seen in decades. And then Wendy sent me a Facebook post, I think, said, hey, what's this bee? And I said, that looks like Cleides estivalis, but that hasn't been seen in years. Long story short, it was. And so it just as an example, here we have a very rare bee that is actually in Wendy's yard, and she had maybe 5 or 6 of these plants. So yes, probably that bee existed in the surrounding landscape and was also drawn in, but now she supports that species. But it wouldn't have been like, oh, I'm going to plant this plant for that bee because I know it'll be successful. So the strategy is diversity, plantings, and then magical things just happen. So I keep mentioning that a lot of these bees are super narrow in focus, specialized in that they only feed their babies pollen from 1 or 2 kinds of plants. And these are the bees that are almost always on the list of conservation concern, because obviously if they don't have that plant, they're not there. So we tend to look at these as the ones that we would prefer their plants be planted for these bees. I'm going to show you some examples. I'm not going to even give you the names for most of these because we don't have time, but they're fascinating. You can just bet on that. And maybe we'll do another lecture another day. Here, so thistles have several species, including that lovely osmia there. Lysomachia, the native Lysomachias, have bees that go to the plant, not necessarily for pollen and nectar, but for oil, because they use oils in their nests. Evening primrose, why bloom in the evening? Because you have bees that only come out in the evening that are specialists on evening primroses. Willows, many people don't even realize that willows bloom. 8 species of mining bees are using willows, to pull off their young. No willows, they're not there. Lots of lovely, I should mention, willows are kind of junky at when they get big, think of weeping willows. But many, not that I'm knocking weeping willows, but many of the willow species, the native ones, are shrubby and just love little damp spots in your lawn and are relatively easy to keep in control and grow. There are plants like this in my backyard, which is a former dump and has every invasive known to mankind. And I have some super good plants like Heliopsis, Helianthoides, that can punch through all these non-native plants that are growing there. Here's another one also from my backyard, which is Ashy Sunflower, that is, is on the dry, junky end of the spectrum of soils. Also good if you have a larger landscape that you want to get naturalized, another recommended one. If you look more at specialists, there's interesting plants like Lyonia, deerberry, which is a type of blueberry. We have different other species of blueberries. So for example, here's high bush blueberry, and there's a couple different species of bees here. Abrapoda is the one in the picture that come to it. And I've seen those in the middle of the city. Agellinus, so a nice little fuzzy Exmelalopsis, loves those purple end of the year flowers. These shrubby cornus, so these are the shrubby dogwoods, which are widely planted. I'm sure in the neighborhood, there's a bunch of these already in there. And I also could guarantee that you have at least Andrena fragilis on those flowers every single year because they specialize on it and they just show up. There's several other species, though, that only go to these shrubby, not the flowering dogwoods. The flowering dogwood has a different group of species, but it's not the same as the congeners that are the shrubbier types. Red osier dogwood, alternate leaf dogwood, gray dogwood, those all have this little set of species. Weird things like pickerelweed out there in the middle of Dyke Marsh has 3 species of bees, all different, that show up on it. Evening primrose redux. Spring beauties, here's your spring beauty bee packing the pink pollen from, that's very onomatopoeic, that in spring woodlands everywhere. Does fine if you can transplant some of the bulbs into the yard underneath that, red maple, and that doesn't have a whole lot of ground cover going on, and then they disappear. Ground cherry, often considered to be a weed, has beautiful little flowers that evert and also has lanterns, and it also has 3 different kinds of bees that only go to it, and they will show up in the middle of a city. Ironweed, good example down on the National Mall, not where, not a lot of habitat on the National Mall, but they planted some of these, and this little Melisodes, this little fluff ball that gathers all the white pollen, shows up. It'll show up in your yard too. Frostasters, which are probably the most common wild native plant that just comes in everywhere, has 6 different species that come in. Woodland sunflowers, not the regular sunflower, but the woodland sunflower, which is a great bedding plant, has its own bee. And we could go on and on. I'm going to give you a listing where we have compiled all the bees that we consider to be specialists and the plants that they work with. The plants that they work with are not going to be rare, right? Because you can't be rare and develop a relationship with other bees, because your rarity is going to cause populations to crash. So that doesn't work. So these are common enough species. That means that you can obtain them and put them in your yard too. A lot of good action. I'm just giving you generalities. Large yellow native plant composites in the fall. Many different kinds. All of them are going to be used and loved by different groups of native bees. Thistles, it's not the kind of thing that a lot of people think about, but there are some. This is why people don't plant this. I don't know. This is Cerseum Horidulum. It is my favorite plant. It is just spectacular. It only gets about 2 feet tall. That bloom can be the size of a dinner plate, and it's just freaking all spine. Anyway, I could go on about the thistles. Here's a morning glory, right? Except it's the native morning glory, man of the earth. And if it's not the native one, then certain bees don't like it, like this lovely big Cimolobus. Chinkapin, this is the congener, the sister to American chestnut, which has some problems, but it also turns out has a a bee that only goes to chestnuts. Thankfully, chinkapin has stuck around, and now we find that the little chestnut groves that people are growing all over the place, including in the area, have this rare bee has come back to it too. Okay, here, if someone could grab that maybe, and throw it into the chat, you could look it up online. Jared Fowler has put together a whole list of the plant species and the bee species that come to them. You know, again, if you like details, there's links and you can go to pages about the species. But if you look over here, you know, you see, although it's in scientific names, these are all, again, really common groups of plants. It just gives you some ideas. I just tell people, look, there are lots of different kinds of plants that support bees. Just start with this list, and you're in the pocket of doing some good for these less common bees. Okay, now kind of wind down here with some examples, and then finally we'll talk about what you can do at a small scale in terms of planting. So Sidwell Friend School, just across the river from you guys, basically middle of high density housing, but lots of plantings by people here. Like this playing field is surrounded by woods, although it happens to be a old concrete dump. The campus itself is super developed. And yet I knew the fifth grade teachers, and they would put out bee traps for me, and we would work on that together with the students, looking at different questions. 80 different species of bees, just with a very little effort, giving you some idea that even in this kind of environment, which would be very similar in aspect to where you guys live, but further from good quality populations of bees, you know, retains a lot of biodiversity, because if you go through those neighborhoods, people have planted many different kinds of plants, and it wasn't a plan, but bees are scooting around from place to place. Baltimore Harbor, probably the least likely place to find anything nature-wise, but a day and a half we spent there, we found in the middle of summer, which is the worst time to find anything, I found 50 different species of bees there, and lots of interesting people, it turns out. But any of these spots, so your edge of the river, your industrial parks, your you know, kind of you know, parks that don't look like they're doing much, often will have quite a bit of action in them. A good example, Dyke Marsh. So I looked at a bunch of specimens that were collected in traps from Dyke Marsh a while ago. Dyke Marsh, you know, I don't know if you know much of the history, but basically it was a graveled operation, and then it was a dump along the edge. When you walk in, look in the woods, just full of concrete slabs. So not like the most awesome place for biodiversity. Park Service has done a great job, and the city trying to bring back some of that area. Well, it turns out these two species here are globally rare, and they showed up in these traps, like the bee on the right, which is Nomata electella. The male of that species had never been described before, and there were only a handful of females that had been found sort of here and there. And in those traps was a whole series of males. So that was Calides ciliatus down at the bottom is a daughter specialist. Again, only a handful of specimens, hadn't been seen in years. There it was, Dyke Marsh. So it's not a far fly to your backyards from Dyke Marsh or a variety of other areas. So don't think that you have no opportunity or that you're too urban or suburban, whatever the excuse is, you are part of the recovery. You know, you should be essentially giving back, repatriating some of that damage, because when we look at and ask the question, okay, are bees declining? Do we have insect apocalypse? All those kinds of things. Well, there's two parts to that. One is, what do the data show in existing parks? And that's a little equivocal, although there's some signs of decline. But on the other hand, it's a no-brainer. Like the house you're sitting in right now, that was great bee habitat at some point in the past. It is not now. That, you know, the paved roads, the cornfields, the playing field, all that kind of stuff is zeroed out from the planet Earth as in terms of good bee habitat. So obviously, of course, we have bee decline because we've taken away a bunch of their habitat. Your yard, though, is probably, well, I shouldn't make cast aspersions about anyone's yard, but a lot of them are not a whole lot better because we've planted them with cultural norms in mind, which is basically you better have a lawn that looks good, and that pretty much zeroed everything out too. So part of my advocacy now at the end of this talk is to let you know that you can, and you saw some examples by planting things, basically become a small refuge. In fact, Doug Ptolemy, who has a similar message, but from a caterpillar's point of view, so moths and butterflies, same thing. Native plants, great. Non-native plants, nothing. Well, pretty much almost nothing. So how would you do that? So this is my yard. It was an acre of lawn, and I've flipped it, perhaps a little wilder than most people like, but we have our choices. And I'm going to show you some of the methods that I use to do that. First of all, in terms of your neighbors, let's say, so you can, it turns out people have studied this. You can do whatever you want as long as the edges of your property, the edges of the sidewalks, your area around your house are neat and tidy and trim and look like everything you've done on purpose. The sign of that is lawn, but it doesn't have to be at a big scale, and tidiness. So otherwise your neighbors are just gonna, mow it when you're gone or call the police because they think perhaps you've passed away. This is good, and you can make it also acceptable at the same time. So you can naturalize vast swords of your property as long as the edges look good. I also want to talk a little bit about these wildflower mixes that you see advertised, or you go to the store and you can buy things online. Most of them have problems. If we go back here, you see most of this is European stock of things. The goal of the seed person is flowers. Like, it has to be a wildflower, and this is a pollinator wildflower mix, and it better have some wildflowers under a lot of harsh conditions because people don't know how to plant anything, and it better be there that first year. It's not about what the support is. So a lot of these mixes of different kinds, including even the very high end ones, are very limited. So what you're looking at is a small set of plants that are easy to grow, produce something that's colorful the first year. And there's no sense of why, from a bee point of view, things are being planted. A lot could be even native, but it's limited. So working with some of your regional native plant nurseries or growing your own, like Earth Song Up is an awesome one that you have down there. And I believe, what is it? Green Spring Nature Center has plant sales. Virginia native plant folks do that regularly. That's where to pick up your stock to get this diversity in place. And I think there's probably others that I don't mention. Growing your own is problematic because of what's happening. So I'm an advocate, particularly in circumstances where you're dealing with yards and or schools, or the kind of thing where you want to really make sure you're successful. So here's what we do. So here's a patch of long grass allowed to grow out, and so that's stage one. That's going to be made into a bed. So stage two is you take your weed whacker and you just beat the heck out of it. You're not tilling it up. You're just taking it down. We'll talk a little bit about this, but you want to preserve even this, maybe harshly done soils and not disturb the soil, because you're going to set the soil back. And you definitely don't want to use herbicides. Even our friend glyphosate is basically, by the way, did you know that it was originally registered as an antibiotic? Yeah, so it's not going to do anyone a favor in terms of soil microfaunas. So it's going to wipe out a lot of those. And so I could go on about that one too, but you want to take it down, and then you want to bring in chips. So in our area, the people who are doing clearing, the arborists, the tree companies, they have a problem. They don't know what to do with their chips. They have to pay. So there's a app called Chip Drop, or you can just call them, and they will drop an entire truckload of chips, which you want, because you want to bury that site, that former lawn, in 8 inches. And what's going to happen is that is going to start reconfiguring your soil in lots of ways. So you're going to invite the community of soil invertebrates and bacteria, and particularly fungi, to begin to thrive, whereas formerly in a compacted soil grass situation, it doesn't happen. It's a very contrived and poor way to treat your soil in some ways. So the chips allow the soil to breathe. So unlike other kinds of treatments that you can think of, this has been documented to be the best way. And it builds up those populations. They essentially will, in a tiny little invertebrate way, rototill that soil under there, which is going to increase the value and the associated mycorrhizal fungi and everything for the plants you put in there, and is going to act as a increase in carbon storage. Will increase because the plants will now be able to put things into the ground for you, and it won't be retracted back out by a poorly constructed bacterial system. It retains water. The mulch helps retain water, but also the soil will retain more water, and it acts as a lot of your weed control. Things like woody plants that were there before, Bermuda grass, sadly, and a couple other things can punch through there, but they're also pretty easy to find and dig out with your favorite little hand ads. So you simply plant right directly into that. You make a little volcano or crater, and then you plant the plant into the soil underneath, and that's it. It's really, that was 2 hours of work, and it works magnificently. This was the septic system at the bee lab. This is the second year, I think, and we just dumped tons of chips on it, planted things into there, and this might have been the first year, and you can scale it up to whatever you want. I'll point out, and a lot of you probably are working on this already because you might have small yards, but really you want to get rid of lawnmowers and move towards what I call plant editors. So you can create lawn. Small amounts of lawn are easy to create with a good quality string trimmer. You can put brush blades on them and take down all your perennials at the end of the year. You can sculpt things, and then you can turn it on its side and just buzz out plants that you don't particularly like baby seedlings of poison ivy and red maple or whatever. So recommendation, this is how I do it here at my house. I'll also, now really winding up, I'll also point out that if you want to come out to the lab, we're working with a variety of local nonprofit groups to reintroduce pollinator plants. We have what amounts to a fairly large native plant nursery with watering systems, 30 acres with no deer, all kinds of good things like that. So if you're interested, you can email me and be a volunteer. There's no structure to it other than I send out emails and say, this is what we're doing, come on out. So here's an example where we're scaling up and planting beds for what we're doing. We do a lot of plant bee, let's call them measurements. And so we have large beds ourselves. And that's it. I can take, if there's time, I'm not looking at the time, but if there's time, I can take questions. Here's contact information. And so back to you, lovely coordinators.
Much, Sam. This has been very, very interesting, and there's just a whole lot of information there. So we appreciate it. Now, one of the questions
you have no idea how much information is really out there.
Yeah, well,
I could do weeks
compacted a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and we've had someone say that they appreciate that. So one question we've had here is that on the chips. So you're meaning wood chips that you used in this last pictures of reacclimating the soil. And a question also, is an 8-inch layer of wood chips enough to keep the grass from growing back up?
Yeah. So, so normal grass, let's call it normal grass. And then there's Bermuda grass, and it's very rhizomatous, and it will, and I've had this happen myself, it will come through. But first of all, it's a lot easier to pull them out through a mulch layer and to also spot them. And also it's a lot more pleasant to work in that kind of environment. And then after a couple of years, your perennial plants have filled in, and your Bermuda grass problem becomes minor.
Okay, another question is, are carpenter bees, are they pollinators?
Yes, I'm going to do an addenda to that last statement, which is to say, in the YouTube sphere of native plant lawn flipping, they'll talk about like skimming off the lawn. No, it's not necessary. But they'll also talk about putting down newspaper and cardboard. Don't do that. It's been shown to really repress your success. So if you think about it, basically newspaper and cardboard will smother the ground, so the oxygen can't get through, and you've just made things a whole bunch harder by doing that. I think for a lot of people it makes sense, and then they don't have to put so much mulch on top, because it acts as it will repress the grass to some degree, but you don't want to do that. Okay, what was the question? The next question?
Are carpenter bees, what category do they fall in, and are they pollen?
Nope, native. They are good pollinators of big, robust plants. So a good example is maypops or passion vine, which is basically designed to be pollinated by carpenter bees. All that weird architecture, just take a look at them. It's designed to place pollen on the backs of carpenter bees as they dip into the well of nectar, mostly in there. And but other things like redbuds are a good example. Big legumes, they do a variety because they're out all year, so they have to be generalists. But yeah, they do. They're part of the environment. But I will also tell you, because people are thinking, how do I get rid of them? So you're going to be a hole manager, right? So spraying and killing them is not the way to go, because there's an infinite supply of carpenter bees in the area. What you need to do is control their nesting. So one way to control it is don't put in any of the soft conifer species like redwood, fir, and cedar. But too late, you already have. So now what do? You basically plug their holes, because once a carpenter makes a nest, subsequent year carpenter bees, they're only single year species, will go right into that hole and make a little leg off it. And so then they can work, without anyone seeing them. It's very convenient. And then you just increase the populations that way. So you want to stick steel wool down the hole and caulk it up, realizing, of course, you're probably plugging up a bunch of baby bees who are crying for their mother in there, but that's, there's penalties. Yeah, that's the best way to deal with carpenter bees.
Okay, we have a question on bee houses. Do you want to talk about like the wind up living in the bamboo tubes or bee houses that people create?
Yeah, so it's a pretty simple system, and you don't have to purchase them. You can make them, and you can make them very easily. So there's two types, basically. One type is a hole drilled in a piece of wood, and the other type is a plant stem that's hollow. Or there's even a few species that like pithy plants. So the holes in wood, you can just drill anything. My front porch is full of holes, and who notices? I do, because I'm looking at the bees that go in and out. Sheds are great, rafter tails. These are bees that are not going to make any additions like the carpenter bee to those. So wood piles, all kinds of places. I also tell people, scrap wood is fine. Doing, like, if you have a 1-inch board, you just drill through the ends, and They don't like to see the opposite end. So you want to stop at the far end and then put it up next to the kitchen window, because you really want to watch what's going on. And you'll see all kinds of cool things that way. You don't have to worry about stinging. They don't defend their nests. And the plant stems take a, something like plume grass, Machanthus, Phragmites are great. And to cut the stems at the end of the year, make them into bundles, cinch the bundles every foot with a zip tie or wire, and then take a handsaw and cut between those cinched areas. And you immediately have a bundle of grass that has all kinds of different sizes of holes and different lengths of holes, and the bees will choose what they want. And it's a very easy way to do. You can just staple that bundle up underneath a rafter on your overhang of your shed, and that's good.
We've got a question that's related about bee bricks. Do you have an opinion on those? I don't actually know what that is, so maybe you would describe
this
that.
is making the rounds right now. So there's in England, apparently, this is the article, I saw the article too. They are requiring new structures, let's say new brick structures, to include X number of bee bricks in there, which is basically a brick with holes in it so that bees can nest in there. I think it's great.
Good. What percentage of native bees are ground dwellers?
I don't know the exact number. I'm going to say on the order of 70 to 80% though. Those are species. If you actually look at numbers, then it's far, far, far greater. So a lot of these ground nesting bees can be unbelievably common. In most cases, except in there's certain exceptions, but in most cases, you have no idea that they're there, because the female is only leaving that nest maybe a few times a day. They don't defend it. They often tuck it under a blade of grass or some obscure thing. They're small holes. You could be lying on top of them or having your picnic. They're not going to do anything about that.
Do bees hibernate?
Not really. So bees are exothermic, so they get their energy from their surrounds, or they don't try to heat themselves like we do. So we spend a lot of our energy budget trying to heat ourselves. 98.5 has a cost, right? And where's the insulation? So they don't. So they're very efficient. And that also means that they can do what they do. And there's different variations on this, which is basically they'll spend the winter underground either in a nest, or if their strategy is to overwinter as adults, they will make a little hole in the ground. And that nest structure will collapse around them. And they're so efficient that they can breathe the oxygen that's just in that little interstitial space. Hibernation is probably something more associated with mammals, where there's a very specific definition. I don't know that counts, but you get their strategy. I think it's often called diapause or something, where they basically way lower their rates. Some bees, and maybe a proportion of all bee species, will skip a year. So I'm not going to come out this year from my nest underground. I'll come out the next year. In desert environments, this is super common strategy. They can skip several years until the rain or whatever the conditions they're looking for are good.
Fascinating. So I'm going to toss one to Christine here, the question that people are wondering about, whether they will have access to these slides and the talk.
Yes, so I will post a recording of this talk on our YouTube channel. And the slides, that would be up to Sam. If he's willing to share them with us, we can, post a link on our website and or on the YouTube channel.
Yeah, I can put it up on our FTP site where you can grab it.
Great.
Thank
you.
And
So,
may I?
yes.
So all of the photographs of the flowers and the bees are public domain, and we take those and you can use them in any way you like. We have a Flickr site with 5,000 photographs on there, super high quality. They'll blow up to the size of a billboard because we're doing weird multiple stacks of species. And we don't want you to even ask. We want you just to take them because we're always going to say yes.
Okay, well, I'll be in contact with you to find out that is, the Flickr account, and then we'll share that
Yeah.
with this group and others. Good. I have a quick question. So I've converted my front garden to natives,
Mhm.
and really do have a lot of bees. And when I see them there, when I'm trying to get in and maybe walk around the garden, so you're promising me they won't bite?
Well, first of all, actually bees can bite. They have these mandibles, but I think
Oh,
you
they
are
won't sting.
referring, well, just being picky here, sting.
Okay.
And no, they won't. But you then may say, well, Sam, I was walking around, I was mowing my grass, and well, why would you be mowing your grass, first of all? But I was walking around and all these bees came out of the ground and stung me. So those are never bees. Those are always yellowjackets, which are wasps.
And they're
So,
mean.
no, they're mean because you put a large vibrating thing right on top of their nest and they feel kind of threatened. You might do it too. If you were a wasp, and you could. So if you do have yellowjackets or even a bald-faced hornet nest, it's basically, if you're further than 5 feet away, you're good. So you don't have to, destroy nests unnecessarily. You should mark it so that the neighbor's kid doesn't run into it.
So, we have a question. Are Yellowjackets native?
So all of the, I'm thinking, because we also study yellowjackets, I believe all the yellowjackets are. There's what looks like a giant yellowjacket called the European hornet, and that is not native. It's related to the murder hornets, by the way. So that one's not native, but the rest of them are, and they serve a function. They are basically vacuuming up tons of caterpillars and other things. They're just big time predators, so it's part of the balance.
So do we have any other questions? If not, I think you've supplied us with a lot of information about what we can do with our yards and gardens to beguile bees, the right kind of bees. And I think it's just kind of being introduced to a wonderful universe. Thank you so much.
You bet. And lots of people, there's an app called iNaturalist, and all you have to do is take a picture and submit it. You don't have to know what it is, and other people online will identify these creatures there. And if you spend a lot of time in your garden, you'll start noticing things, and it actually makes a contribution too, because that information is used to, for the species it's you can do it with as an assessment of how the environment's doing.
So that's more citizen scientists.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
You bet. It was my pleasure.
Okay.